Stop using the standard logger in Python, or even worse, not bothering with that and just using print everywhere. Go ahead and use Loguru instead. It's intended to make Python logging way less painful with a bunch of awesome features to save you the headaches of other loggers. It makes you forget it's even there, and it's super easy to migrate to as well. It's a near drop-in replacement. So let's check it out. Installing it is as simple as any other Python package. Just go ahead and use pip, and you can add it to your requirements.txt as well. Then, wherever you want to use it, you can go ahead and just import the logger from the Loguru package, and it's part of the brilliance of Loguru that there is only one logger and it's ready to go right away. So we can already run this function here of logger.info and then hello world, and if we check this out in the terminal, we should see that we already get nicely formatted messages straight out of the box. Running the application then, you see we get a nicely formatted log message. We have the time of the log message, we have the level, and then we have the scope. In my case, the scope is main because I ran that Python file directly. And then we have module as well because I didn't put that logger within a function or a class or anything like that. And then we have the line number, which was 3. And then finally, the message itself. So we already have a super nice log format straight out of the box with just one import. So we used logger.info there, but we can start using our log levels now too. As you can see out of the box, it comes with a few standard ones like trace, debug, error, and critical. And if we check this out in the console, we get some nicely formatted log messages. Now you may notice though that the trace level is missing. That's because Loguru defaults to using debug as its minimum level, which causes any logs with a severity level lower than debug to go ahead and be ignored. We can change this though. To configure this then, we'll be using Loguru's one function to rule them all, and that's this logger.add function here. This is where you'll do all of your configuration for the Loguru package. Quickly before that though, if you want to learn more about how you should configure and use your logs, check out this video on logging best practices and subscribe for more great stuff like that. Back to configuration though, if you need to add in a handler, change the format of your logs, filter or set the level of them, it's all done with this add function here. Before you do anything though, you may want to get rid of the default configuration, and you can do that by running logger.remove and then 0 like so, and then we set up our own with this function here. The first argument of the add function is going to be your output stream, so where you want your logs sent to, and in our case we'll use system.standardError, which is essentially just the console. The next argument we've got set up here is the level, and I set that to trace. So this is the minimum level of logs that we want to show up in our output stream, and again in our case the console, so anything below that level will now be ignored, but since we set this to trace, we should now see everything. And there you go, running the application, you can now see that we're getting that trace message out, which we weren't getting before, as we've now changed that minimum log level that shows up. Let's go ahead and configure this further by changing the format of the log messages themselves. To change the format, all we have to do is pass in the format argument into that add function that we were using earlier. And as you can see, I'm using some Python formatting directives in here as well. In this example, I'm just changing the format to show us the time of the log, the level of the log, and then finally the message, and I've separated it with this pipe symbol here. You can do some really powerful things with this formatting directive. You can come in here and change the way the time is displayed, for example, and there's a load of other cool options you can add for things that you want to display in your log messages. You can even take this a step further of customizability and add in your own color scheme with this markup syntax as well. I'll leave a link in the description down below to the documentation that's going to show you all of the options that you can pick for these. As you can see, now when I run my application, we get the timeout in green, we get the log level, and then finally we get the message itself. So it's now using the format that we just configured. So that's the basics of how we configure our logs, but let's look at making them even better now with some contextual information. So this is when you want to make your logs a lot more useful by including some relevant information that's going to help you for future things like correlating and filtering. For example, if you're running an online shopping platform and a seller updates one of their products, you might want to include things in the log message like the seller and product ID. Before we do that though, you do need to ensure that this extra directive is in your logging format, as that's going to be where it shows all of that custom information that we add to our messages. With that set up, there are two ways that we can add some extra information to our log messages. The first one is going to be by using the bind method here. The bind method actually returns a child logger that inherits any existing contextual data from its parent, and then it creates a custom context, which is then included in all of its log records. So where we're doing logger.bind and we have a seller ID and a product ID, anything that we log on that child logger is now going to have that contextual information attached to it. So we go ahead and run this. You can see that that log message of product page open here now has that contextual data of the seller ID and product ID there. Using this child logger approach doesn't impact our main logger at all, so this contextual information isn't added to the logger up here, so we continue to do things like logger.info and it won't have this information attached. So this is really useful when you do want to do things within a scope, for example. So if you have a function that's handling request IDs, you could add in that contextual information into a child logger within that function without impacting your main logger. The alternative way to do this without using a child logger is to use the contextualize function here. This actually goes ahead and modifies our extra dictionary directly without creating any new logger instance. This method does need to be used with a with statement though, as you can see down here. So if I run this, you can see that we get the exact same effect as we did with that bind function, but there's just two different ways to do this based on whether you want to create that scope with the child logger or just simply attach it using contextualize straight away and that with directive. You can see that we get the exact same outcome as we did when we used the bind function, but it just shows you there's two different ways that you can add in your information based on your needs. Talking about the with statement though, this is also super useful if we want to log out our errors. If we use it to run a function, so we do with and then logger.catch, as you can see here, I'm going to be running a function that returns an error as it tries to do 50 divided by 0. We should see that we get the error message and the stack trace in our extra information here. And there you go, running the application, you can see we get the timestamp, we get the level, then we get the message, and then finally we get the stack trace at the end, all in that extra statement as well. If you don't like those with statements, an alternative way to do this would be with a decorator. So above our function here, we can do @logger.catch, then we can go ahead and run the function. And again, if we go ahead and check this out in the terminal, you can see it gives us the same effect. We get the error message, the stack trace, and all of that extra information. This catch function here can actually take in a load of arguments as well to customize which specific errors you'd like to pick up, which error levels you'd like to pick up, and a whole load more. So I recommend you check out the documentation for that. Let's look at a few more powerful features then. The first one is going to be in the add function here, so our configuration. If we then set serialize to true here, this is going to output our logs in JSON format. So we go to the console now, and if I just clear this, we run the application again, you can see we have that same log message, but it's now coming out in structured JSON. This is going to be super useful if you work with things like log exporters or collectors. Speaking of which, this is a good time to check out our sings. This is this argument here. Earlier we set this to the console, so the system.standardError, but Loguru actually supports file-based logging as well, and all you need to do is actually just change this out for a file name. So I could call this something like test.log, and that will now start logging all of our information to that log file. So if I run the application, you can see that we aren't getting any console messages anymore, and that's because I've set up the logging to go to a file instead. So back in our files, you can see that it created the test.log file that I set up here, and if we go inside of that, you can now see we have my log messages being sent to the file instead. When you use a file sync, you're even able to configure things like the retention and the rotation of those files, and you can even do things like compression of the log file itself. I'll leave a link to a blog post we have in the description down below that's going to go through a load more custom configuration that you can do. But before you check out file-based logging, let's see how we could centralize these logs instead by using BetterStack. If you don't already know, BetterStack is the fastest log search on the planet. You get a super nice UI to look through your logs, and you can do some really powerful querying as well. Even better, you can get started with a free account. Once you're signed up, you're going to want to go to the dashboard, then hit telemetry and sources, and we'll hit connect source. Then paste in a friendly name. I'll call this one Loguru demo. And then in platform, we can scroll down and find our Python option down here. Click that and then hit connect source. You'll want to store this source token for later. For the rest of these steps, I'll actually be using our documentation, so I'll leave this linked in the description down below. But our first step is to go ahead and install the logtail-python package, so I'll copy this. And then in our project, I'll go ahead and install that. Back in the code then, the first thing you'll want to do is import the logtail handler from the logtail package. Next, we'll set up the handler by doing logtail handler and then passing the source token as the first argument. This is the token that you just copied from betterstack.com when we created that source. The next cool thing we can do with Logger is we can actually set up two different syncs. So this one here is the one we've been configuring already. This is just going to print things out to the console using system.standardError and then this format here. But you can actually just do logger.add again if you want to set up another handler. Then here we pass through the handler we just configured for BetterStack. So this is going to be sending our logs to BetterStack instead. We change the format to simply just be the message, and then we can configure things like the level, the diagnose, and backtrace as well. So if I save this and run the application, we should see that we're getting console messages as well as our logs being sent to BetterStack. Running the application then, you can see we're getting that console message of subscribe there. Let's head over to BetterStack. And you can see here, if you click on Livetail, you should be seeing your log messages coming through here, and you can see some different information on it. So we have the message there, we have the log level, and you can actually expand this to find out more, like the runtime, the system, the file name, level, a load of other cool things. And then you can add these to queries if you want to filter down the log messages to find something specific. And you can even create metrics out of the log messages as well, and a load of other powerful features. So I highly recommend you check out BetterStack. There we go, your applications are now way easier to debug and they're ready for production. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments down below, and as always, see you in the next one.